In 2010, audiences were treated to 13 episodes that made up Matt Smith's debut series as the Doctor. Series 5 was, and still is, a very fresh and exciting watch. Steve Moffat and his team from the word go understood what Doctor Who was as a show. There's no complacency at all. Here, Moffat and his team crafted a truly memorable and fantastic series where they successfully reinvented a show that ultimately didn't need reinventing. Bearing in mind the David Tennant and overall RTD era, which they'd just concluded, was immensely popular. Ratings were sky high and reviews were very positive. So Moffat didn't need to radically reshape an already popular show, but because he did, he had a vision for the show and wasn't complacent or lazy when making it. Series 5 is a refreshing watch still, after over a decade, because it's still Doctor Who at its core, but totally different from any of the previous 4 series, and that was simply brilliant. Series 5 was very well received by audiences and critics. A second series starring Matt Smith was quickly confirmed and began airing in April 2011. Series 6 was the first series in New Who to be split in half. This decision wasn't universally praised, but years later, I think it worked. Thematically speaking, it worked very effectively, although mainly as Series 6 originally aired. On rewatches, the gap doesn't mean anything at all. But the split really wasn't that bad at all, and it was interesting to have Doctor Who air in the autumn. Series 6 really upped the ante. It has a much larger sense of scale than any series before it. In terms of the wider series arc, Series 6 expanded further on the silence and the cracks in time. In many respects, Series 6 acts as a sequel to Series 5, and watching both these series next to each other in a marathon seems ideal. River Song is far more prominent in Series 6 than she was in Series 5. In the 6th series, we find out her identity. River Song, being Amy and Rory's daughter, was a big reveal at the time, but years later, does it still hold weight? Well, not quite as much. A large part of why River Song was such an appealing character was the mystery. Now that it was gone, River Song just wasn't as interesting, though Alex Kingston was still just as great. As always, the romance between the Doctor and River Song wasn't fully realised effectively. It's not bad, but it feels all too predictable. So Series 6 isn't as good as Series 5, but it is still great. The cinematography was jaw-droppingly good, especially during the scenes filmed in Utah. The main cast, Matt Smith, Karen Gillan, Arthur Darvill, improved on their debut series. Their performances are all even better. Series 7 didn't begin airing until September 2012, 11 months after Series 6 concluded. So after a long wait, audiences were in for a disappointment. Series 7 began with Asylum of the Daleks, which itself is a very poor opening. There are plot holes aplenty, and it's a sign that Moffat isn't that great at writing the Daleks. The performances and the cinematography are both great, as they usually are, but the script is so poor, filled with plot holes as mentioned, but also illogical and frankly out of character decisions. The episode also should have been a two-parter, an issue that crops up more often than not with this series. I won't go through every episode, because firstly, the video will be longer than it already is, and secondly, nobody wants to hear me talk about every episode in some degree of detail, so anyway, let's move on. Series 7 practically abandoned the silence arc that featured so prominently during Matt Smith's first 2 series. At the time, Series 6 did receive some mixed reviews due to its complex overarching narrative, and Moffat decided to simplify things with his 3rd series, At the Help. Now, that is not necessarily a problem, but now I think Moffat should have stuck with the silence arc and taken it into more interesting directions. Series 7 does have an arc of its own, the Impossible Girl arc, which centred on the identity of Clara Oswald, the Doctor's new companion who joins him at the beginning of 7B. This arc is nowhere near as interesting as the silence arc and robs audiences of a potentially well-written character. In Series 7B, Clara isn't a character, she's a plot device, and not a very interesting one at that. Jenna Coleman is great in 7B and has a great on-screen chemistry with Matt Smith, but here, her character is practically non-existent. Series 7 had no two-parters, and this gives many episodes a distinctly rushed feel. A brisk pace can be good, but here, nearly every episode feels rushed and somewhat incoherent. Why were two-parters dropped when it clearly didn't work? Two-parters were absent from the second half of Series 6, but there was still the overarching silence plot to keep audiences interested. Here in Series 7, there's far less to keep audiences hooked and wanting more. Stephen Moffat was clearly creatively drained by the time Series 7 rolled by. The drop in quality is somewhat surprising. He'd written some clunky episodes before, such as Let's Go Hitler, but they were still quite rare, and the overall arc worked pretty well. Here the arc is much weaker, and the episodes individually are of a far lower quality than what we can come to expect at this stage. In around 2012 and 2013, Moffat was putting a lot of attention into Series 7 of Doctor Who, Series 3 of Sherlock, and the 50th anniversary special of Doctor Who, alongside all of the other 50th anniversary celebratory specials and events being organised that he was in some way a part of, even if he wasn't overseeing every tiny aspect. It was only inevitable that something would be a tad weak, and that was Series 7. Fortunately, the 50th anniversary special was brilliant. At the time, I I considered it to be a solid 10 out of 10 episode, but now, years later, it's more like an 8 out of 10, but it's still great, and a fitting tribute to the show whilst building towards the future. The Day of the Doctor, interestingly, brings back a few elements from the RTD era, such as the 10th Doctor, the moment in the form of Bad Wolf, and of course, most notably, the Time Warp. This episode suitably wrapped up the Time Warp, with the show only rarely bringing up the concept before in the Moffat era. The Day of the Doctor was Matt Smith's penultimate episode, as Smith had announced his departure from the series in June 2013, so the Silence arc, which had been practically unused throughout Series 7, barring some sparse references, was back. The Time of the Doctor is just one big problem. That may sound harsh, but for many people, including myself, this episode is just one big mess. The Silence arc was finally being resolved. The last episode where the arc prominently featured was over 2 years previously in The Wedding of River Song. Here, Stephen Moffat had to resolve many loose threads in just 1 hour. Some loose threads had been resolved in Series 6, but several more were left lingering. I'm not sure who to point the finger to, perhaps the schedulers or basically somebody at the very top of the BBC. In short, The Time of the Doctor should have been a two-parter. Nothing so much to do with the Silence arc, more to do with the fact that this was Matt Smith's final story. To have it as a single 60-minuter feels a bit crap. The Time of the Doctor does indeed resolve the arc. It's never used at all during the following Peter Capaldi era. However, I think that Stephen Moffat should have started resolving the arc throughout Series 7, so that Matt Smith's final episode didn't feel quite as rushed and felt more impactful. The Time of the Doctor spends its opening 20 minutes or so making infantile Christmas-themed jokes, when really the story should get cracked on as soon as possible, especially when you have such little time to spare. Series 7 represents a big drop in quality for Doctor Who. It's a shame that it's by a country mile the weakest Matt Smith series. Had Matt Smith stayed for another series, who knows how things would have panned out. So Series 7 was the problem with the Matt Smith era. What started as a brilliantly fresh and exciting era of the programme ended with more of a splutter than a bang.